So here we are in Max. This is essentially the start of the workflow. As with every good thing in life, it all begins in Max. This is where we create our assets, so our visuals for our projection and for our pixel mapping, as well as our spatial audio engine. That's all getting done and spatialized in here. I think the best approach to this is going to be to talk about the visual side of the stuff first, and then we'll talk about the spatialization. As with the Unreal side of stuff, this isn't going to be an in-depth tutorial. This is just going to be a good overview. But yeah, we'll start with the visual side of stuff. So on the left-hand side of the screen here, this is where all of the visuals are being generated. And I'm using JIT, which is Max's visual engine. It's the visual side of Max. And specifically the JIT-GL protocols, so it's all based on OpenGL, which is an open source 3D engine. It's been around for a while. It's open source. It's very powerful though, and we can make some quite cool abstract sort of shapes with it. I chose to go for the 3D stuff rather than just using basic JIT matrix stuff because I can rotate the object and I can warp it in 3D space based on my audio signal, whether that be amplitude of a certain frequency or amplitude in general. So the workflow for this, if we kind of try and follow the patch cables as much as possible, because it is a bit of a mess. Anyone who's used Max before knows how quickly it can get messy, though I do try to keep it as tidy as I can. Everything is being fed by this playlist. I've got a couple of extra tracks in there that I was just using for development, but at the top we've got the track that we were using, Games by Teddy Hunter. And it comes out of this and it comes into a JIT catch object, which is going to catch that audio, sample that audio, and pass it on as a JIT message to do other things. It goes into a JIT matrix, and what that does is it kind of generates this glitchy pattern here. So if I click play over here, and I let it play for a little bit, we'll start seeing these black and white patterns, this glitchy kind of grid start to appear on this screen. And this is just so we can see what's going on. And that gets fed through a slide which kind of normalizes the values and smooths things out so it's not just too frantic or anything like that. That gets fed into a JIT gen object. Now gen is sort of like a subset of Max where lots of complicated mathematical things happen that I don't fully understand. I just sort of play around with things and plug things into things and see what it does, which is kind of the benefit of working with a visual coding platform like Max. But what this is doing is it's just kind of doing a little bit of maths on these values that are being passed through and outputting vectors as a way of distorting a 3D object. So if we want to actually see this 3D object and how it's warping, this is the image that gets output. This is the stuff that gets projected onto the floor, and you can see that with each beat, if I turn the music up a little bit so we can hear it, you can see that it's being warped and glitched in time with the music. You can also see that the color's changing, and this is done by sensing anything that comes in below 250 Hertz with a high pass filter. And I'm feeding that into this over here, so PackGL color, which is sending messages to this JIT-GL mesh. So the JIT-GL mesh is what dictates the actual shape itself. And this is where I'm affecting the red, green, blue and alpha values to kind of make it pulse a little bit in color and brightness to kind of keep it interesting. And most of that is done from a high-passed signal, but some of it is done through general amplitude as well. I'm just going to bring that down a little bit more just so it doesn't distract me. So yeah, this is all very audio reactive. This is all supposed to be in sync with the music as much as possible. And I think it's done some really interesting stuff, and especially once we bring it into Unreal and we start projecting it on the floor and using it for pixel mapping, I think it's really effective. But what I ended up having to do is export this through OBS using the Spout plugin and recording the ambisonic file as a separate thing. So that's probably a good time to segue across to the spatial audio section of the patch. So over here on the right hand side, as I said, we have our spatial audio section. Now it looks relatively simple because it's only using really a couple of objects to do what we need it to do. And that's because I'm using the SPAT5 external library, specifically the Panoramics object, which is a mixing platform designed really to make spatial audio a much simpler, more accessible process. So if I double click on here, we're shown a mixing interface. And what I'm doing here is I'm bringing in my stereo channels here. I'm packing them into a multi-channel patch cable, and I'm splitting that out through my routing matrix into 6 mono tracks as left and right. So 1 and 2 is, so 1 is left, 2 is right, 3 is left, 4 is right, and so on and so forth. And then I'm able to use those as objects to mimic speakers. So now, well, in most spatial audio workflows, you might be trying to think of your individual sources as an object. As I stated earlier, my goal was to mimic speaker arrangement. So I had to think about this slightly differently and started thinking about my objects more as the outputs rather than the inputs. So these are essentially my speaker positions within my Unreal scene. So I've got 2 ways that I'm routing this. I've got my binaural bus, which is here, and that's mainly for monitoring. That's what we're listening to right now. And then I've got my ambisonic bus, and that is what is outputting my first order ambisonic file. Why are we outputting first order and not second, third, fourth, or fifth? I'd love to be using something third order at minimum, really, just for the resolution, but sadly Unreal only accepts first order, so we have to work within those boundaries. So the way this works is it comes through these buses and it also gets shared with this reverb channel as well. As we move our objects around, that changes the amount of reverb that we start to hear within our mix, and this is mimicking some psychoacoustic effects. This is mimicking the way that we actually hear. So as we move things further away, the ratio of direct sounds that we hear compared to the reverberant sound changes. And that's true to real life. As things get further away from you, you stop hearing the direct sound as much and you start hearing the reverberant sound. It also helps with interaural differences. So as someone is talking to you from your right side, for instance, that sound is going to hit your right ear before it hits that left ear, and there's going to be a slight phase difference. And it's a big part of how we localize sound. So the way that Panoramics works, it does all of that stuff in the background, that clever stuff in the background. So over here, I've got my main left and right. So mono 1 is my left, mono 2 is my right. And this is facing the front, which you can tell by looking at this little guy down here. He's got his 2 ears and his nose sticking out there. So this is in front of our perspective. This is how we need to think about this. So I've got my main left and right here, and I'm going to solo those, and we're going to move those around a little bit and kind of get a sense of what the plugin is actually doing. So if I bring this up. I'm going to move these away from us. You can hear that change in reverb. It's quite subtle, quite natural. If we're right up close, listen carefully, you can hear the reflection. You can hear the direct sound much more on the left-hand side while it's over here, but you will hear a little bit of reflection on your right-hand ear. It's just simulating that interaural difference. It's timing differences. Is lost by my reset their positioning because they've gone a little bit skew-if there. So let's just reset that positioning. 3 meters, 3 meters. So as I was saying, what I've done here is I've created my main left and rights, and then I've created different delay fills at different positions in the room. So I've got some that are at complete 90 degrees to our perspective, so exactly left and right. And then I've got some that are behind me. Now the difference with these is that I've reduced the overall gain of these signals to kind of try and keep the perspective at the front as much as possible. So if I start to bring these in, I'm going to start by bringing in the back ones so we can hear more of that difference from the ones at the rear, and then I'll add the center ones. So here we go. Oh, and of course we're coming to the end of the song, so just give me a second, we'll restart that song. Okay, here we go. So this is just the left and rights at the moment. And we'll let it get into a little bit more of an obvious part of the song. We've got a lovely stereo image with a nice natural reverb. Now I'm going to add my rears. So these are at -6 dB. So they're still present, but they're a little bit lower, which should hopefully keep the front a little bit more dominant. To me, it sounds like it does. It might not to you, but I think it does. So here's my rears. It's filling it out nicely. And in fact, we could probably go down a bit more. Let's try it at -12. And just go down that little bit more. So still very much at the front. The presence is still very forward. Here's without. I like it a little bit higher actually, so let's bring it back. Let's go -9, split the difference. Cool. So let's mute those again, bring it back to the front, and add our side fills. I might actually bring those down a bit more because they are that little bit closer and a little bit more direct. So let's bring them down to -6 without them. With them. Now let's do them all together. And just for fun while we're here, because who doesn't love doing this, let's give it an extreme reverb. Just the front. All of them. Now a few other things that I have done here just to keep things a little bit cleaner. I have EQ'd some of the signals. So I've EQ'd these side and rear fills with just a simple high pass filter, because in a real world scenario, our front of house speakers is where our substacks are going to be. And there aren't really, unless the space is huge, going to be many subs anywhere else. So bass frequencies are always a really good way of kind of helping solidify that localization, even though they are pretty omnidirectional. It's a good way of sort of forcing us forwards. Most of the localization we get is in high frequencies, but for this sort of content, just pushing that bass frequency so they're emanating from the front and not the sides is a good shout. So I've done that for all of my side and rear fills. I'm going to reset my reverb as well, just so we know. And yeah, I mean, that was not what I wanted to do. Another fun thing to try and do while we're here is to listen to the track without any spatialization on, because actually we've not heard what the original track is in this setting. So what I'm going to do is just duplicate this gain plugin here and patch that into my Easy DAC like that. So patching that into my output, and I'm going to reduce the volume of that and just patch in my left and right from my track. Okay, so now I can bring my spatial one down and increase my non-spatialized one. So it's quite an airy track anyway, but you can really hear it. Bring that down and bring our spatial one up. And actually I think in the final piece I chose to increase that reverb to about 3 or 4 seconds, just to really sell the effect. It's a beautiful mix done by a friend of mine, Marcus, and kindly we had permission from Teddy to use this. Gorgeous song, gorgeous mix, and I've just put it into a room. Actually, maybe that's a little too much reverb, but it sounds quite good. But I mean, without the reverb, adds so much. So yeah, that is the spatial engine, that is the visual engine that's going on. And there's a few more bits modulating in the visual engine as well. So I've obviously, as I said, I've got the amplitude of the signal and low end modulating certain parts of the signal, but I've also got time frequencies, LFOs, modulating different aspects that just sort of change the shape and keep things really varied. So it just creates a really nice abstract pattern to use in projection. And then, as I said earlier, once we start overlapping those patterns and getting even more abstract patterns upon abstract patterns, I'm so happy with how it came out. So yeah, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you enjoy the sizzle reel as well if you haven't watched it already. All the best.